Hello everyone and welcome to episode 29 of the Layton Fitness podcast. Now in today's episode is going to be slightly different. I'm basically going to discuss some of the biggest mistakes I've made with my personal nutrition and training approach and then how I've adapted this. And the reason why I'm hoping this is going to be very valuable to you is hopefully you can relate to some of the previous mistakes I've made. You can realize this and then you can adapt your approach to be a more evidence-based, more optimal approach for you. So hopefully you'll be able to recognize the mistakes and think, oh, I'm doing that as well at the moment, and then you can make the change. So I'm really hoping this will be potentially even more valuable than some of the other episodes where I'm just going into the topic in very much a chronological order, whereas now you're almost getting a mini case study of me, and then hopefully you can adapt and start applying the correct principles afterwards. So some of the biggest problems I've made incorrectly in the past is this concept of focusing on the minor details and missing the bigger picture. And I personally think this is probably the biggest problem within the fitness industry at the moment. People like these sexy new ideas, these things that really potentially make little or no difference whatsoever, but the broad strokes as such, the bigger picture things just aren't as sexy, yet these are the components that get you 99% of your results. And those are really the following: focusing on macronutrient intake, focusing on caloric intake by the end of the day, focusing on progressive overload. Those two in itself, by tracking things and manipulating food intake subject to the goals, is the big broad strokes as such. Yet if I asked you honestly listening to this podcast, would you know exactly what you had yesterday in terms of your daily intake? But you might be able to tell me your super duper post-workout shake you're now taking, or the brand new high volume routine you're now doing from Flex magazine, which is tailored for a drug assisted individual. So these kind of sexy ideas don't necessarily equate to your ultimate overall results. So I think that's my biggest mistake I've made in the past. So hopefully you can start applying that philosophy from now on. Focus on these broader strokes rather than getting stuck into the minor details. Another big mistake I've made in the past is following routines similar to what I just mentioned then that are tailored for a drug assisted individual. And you'll see the typical, whatever gym you go to, you're going to have some steroid users in there, and you'll see them train. And typically it's training one body part per day, focusing on the pump, higher repetitions, etc. You need to realise if these individuals are on steroids, they can essentially train how they please, and they're going to see progress. I've even seen one study where people have gained muscle mass via anabolic steroids without doing any training whatsoever. So you can see the power of this. Now, by trying to take that same principle as a natural trainee and train in the same way, you're not going to get the results you desire. It's certainly more optimal for a natural to train each body part at least 2 to 3 times a week. And if you're still yet to do this, you'll see some really big jumps in strengths and improvements in your physique in a relatively short space of time, just because you're not used to this. Now, with that being said, do I therefore say that you should just double your volume immediately, which is sets times reps times load, which is ultimately the amount of work you're doing to train everything twice a week? No, not at all. And I think the easiest way would just be to work out your current reps and sets for the routine you're doing at the moment, and then half that, and then start training everything twice a week. So ultimately you're getting the same amount of volume within the week, but just a higher frequency. And then you can start progressing from there. So some good examples of this would be, say, an upper-lower split, or a push-pull legs, or any body part split where you're training each muscle group at least twice per week. So this is another big mistake I've made in the past, and hopefully you can start applying to your programming. Another big problem, a little bit like I mentioned before, focusing on the pump and the feel of the exercise. We've all heard, statements from Arnold Schwarzenegger where he'd refer to the pump and how it's all about the last few reps that make the muscle grow. Yet we know now that volume is one of the biggest primary influences for hypertrophy, and as a result we need to be focusing on increasing this volume over a larger period of time, with the caveat the load's heavy enough. Now, what does that mean to you? So basically you want to be using all of the rep ranges, so the lower reps and moderate reps and even a little bit of higher rep work, focusing on the bigger compound lifts, your squats, your deadlifts, your overhead presses, your bench press, your pressing variations, your rowing variations, etc. Focusing on using all those rep ranges and focus on progressive overload. Focus on trying to get stronger within any given rep range. And this doesn't necessarily mean making progress every session, but over a chronic period of time we should see progress in the volume, the load you're using. So there's another key point, coming away from the subjective pump, feel, opinions of how your workout goes, and actually coming more to an objective, measurable approach, i.e. did you make progress compared to last month, etc., etc. So that therefore means you should be bringing a notepad and pen to the gym, tracking your results or tracking it in your phone, and start doing this. And these are where your big jumps and progress comes. 1, focusing on a proper program for a natural training. 2, tracking your progress in terms of the training side of things. Another big mistake I've made in the past is focusing on food sources rather than the dosages. And what I mean by that is, as I discussed in some of my previous podcast episodes, especially episode 1 where I discussed the clean eating myth, people miss the bigger picture by focusing on foods in isolation without taking into account the dosage of this food within the day's intake, within the week's intake, etc., etc. So the point I'm making is the dosage of the food dictates whether that food is good or bad. So an example I've given on some other episodes, most people consider, say, basmati rice a quote-unquote clean food. However, if we overconsume this to a point where we're in a 5,000 calorie surplus at the end of the day, you're going to gain body fat regardless of whether that food's considered clean or not. So I'm not saying just eat complete junk and fit it within your daily macronutrient and calorie targets, because by default it's very difficult to meet these figures without mainly adding the majority of food from whole single ingredient food. In addition to this, we don't want to have any micronutrient deficiencies either. But at the same time, you cannot say whether a food is good or bad in isolation without considering the dosage of that food and how it fits into the rest of your day's intake. So hopefully that makes sense. That was the biggest mistake I've made in the past, just focusing on, oh, this food's good, I'll just have as much as I like, I won't even consider total calories and macronutrients. And that's where the majority of people go wrong, especially people who transition to more of a healthier approach where they're just eating quote-unquote healthier foods. But if you don't consider the total calories and macronutrients, you can still gain body fat regardless of if food's good or bad, subject to that dosage within your diet. So that's just such a key point, and that was a real game changer for me, and hopefully that will be a game changer for you as well. Now, other big mistakes, similar to what I mentioned above, just being very black and white of my approach, and often the answer lies somewhere in the middle. And I've literally done everything: follow the paleo diet, high carb, low carb, being obsessed with nutrient timing, avoiding social occasions, etc., because I wanted to stay on track with my nutrition. No gluten, intermittent fasting, tried everything. And again, all of these are a classic case of missing the forest for the trees, almost focusing on the minor details rather than actually having a diet which is set up for my personal preferences, my lifestyle and my goals. And all of the above were very exclusive diets, in the sense there's certain foods that need to be excluded, and that's a big problem. Unless you actually have an allergy to a certain food, there's no reason why you shouldn't avoid it, unless you just don't have a preference to eat that. So that was a big thing I learnt there. Next big thing, well, this almost came a little bit after finding out some of these things. I had an actual coach, like an online personal trainer, very similar to what I do now, about 4 years ago, and this really opened my eyes to focusing on the quantities of food rather than the foods in isolation, having a better approach to training in terms of having the program set up for it to be more optimal for a natural trainee. And the biggest thing I found here was it was almost a freeing feeling. So a lot of people think that when they track their food intake, it's an obsessive thing, but actually frees you, because ultimately it allows you to still enjoy life, go on social occasions, etc., go out, enjoy time with your friends, but you're not confined to, oh, I need to be eating every 2 to 3 hours, oh, I can't have that because it's a quote-unquote bad food. Ultimately, you can edit your intake subject to what you sow. For example, if you're going out in the evening, you know it's going to be a higher carb, higher fat meal, you can almost subtract that intake from the rest of the day's intake, even if it's not going to be perfect, but you can ultimately manipulate things to suit everything in your lifestyle, whereas previously I wouldn't even go to that social event. So if you're in a similar situation to this, I really do strongly recommend taking on this approach, because this will be a big game changer. It's so much less stressful, especially coming away from being obsessed with nutrient timing and eating every 3 hours. That's just ridiculous. If you go back to some of my podcasts, I'll go into depth why you can essentially have longer leeways in between your meals, etc. But I won't go into that today. But if you're that type of individual, it's worth looking into that further. Next big breakthrough was my mentor, Joseph Agu, who is an outstanding practitioner. Really is. He's worked for the English Institute of Sport. He's now doing his PhD for nutrition intervention for sprinters, I believe. Very intelligent guy. And the biggest thing that Joe taught me, he basically taught me how to fish. You know the analogy, you give someone a fish, they eat for the day. You teach them to fish, they fish for a lifetime. He really taught me how to look at the scientific research journals, how to use context and critical thinking to analyze the weight available evidence, and ultimately let this dictate application in the real world. And that's not to say that science has all of the answers, but being critical and having that application knowledge to use it in the real world really did help me massively. So that pretty much rounds everything up, and hopefully you can take a lot from this, and hopefully seeing everything in more of a case study manner, i.e. these are the mistakes I've made, are you doing any of these, and then adapt them to what is a little bit more optimal, should hopefully really help you. But the big take I want to give is just this concept of focusing on the bigger picture. The minor details are only important in certain contexts. It's not to say they're irrelevant, but make sure you're putting the bigger picture things first. And then if you want to dive into some of the minor details, you can do once those broad strokes, those bigger picture things are in place first. So those were really focused on daily macronutrient caloric intake requirements, focusing on progressive overload, and then manipulating nutrition variables subject to progress to help you achieve your fat loss and muscle growth goals. Certainly look back to all of my other previous episodes where I discussed some of these specific topics in more detail, and that will improve your knowledge, and hopefully you can start applying that as well. However, if you're still yet to download my free ebook, How to Set Up a Nutrition Plan, if you go to James Layton, Layton Fitness.co.uk, and if you're interested in learning more about me and my online coaching services, you can also go to my website as well. Okay, thank you very much for listening. I'll look forward to speaking to you next week.